Welcome. Seasoned Citizens present. Our program today is the FBI, Yesterday and Today. I am Walter Jensen, the narrator, and with me is my guest today, Harlan Phillips, former FBI agent. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Walter.
Harlan, would you mind telling us a little about your background and about your time in the FBI?
I was born in West Liberty, Iowa, close to here, and moved to Muscatine at an early age, went through public schools here, attended the University of Northern Iowa, coached football for about 3 years over in central Iowa before going in the FBI, and I spent 27 years in the FBI as an agent in various parts of the country, and retired in 1981. And since that time, I moved back to Muscatine about 3 years ago, and I've been in the private investigative business since 1981. So I've been back in Muscatine, came back home about 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a summary.
Oh, yes. Well, of course, I knew your father real well. I'd met you times before, but since you've been home, I've been more acquainted with you, and it's nice to have you back.
Thank you.
Can you give us a little idea of the FBI training that you had or had to have?
When you're appointed as a special agent with the FBI, you go to Quantico, Virginia. And the FBI has its academy on the Marine base at Quantico. And there you have to spend 4 months in basic training consisting of firearms training, learning about the various violations the FBI handles, legal procedures, physical defensive tactics and physical training. And it's a very rigorous training for about 4 months. They say it's equivalent to about a year of college. But it is a 4-month period of training, 6 days a week. And at that time, then you come out and are sent to your first field office.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Well, now, it seems like we have something in common together. You said you were born near West Liberty. It was northeast of West Liberty and in Cedar County. I was born also in Cedar County, about 3 or 4 miles east of where you were born. Now, what year was it that you were born in there?
I was born in 1931.
1931. Well, I go back a little further. I was born in 1907. And did your folks stay around there very long at that time?
No, we moved shortly thereafter to Illinois City and lived there just a couple years, and my mother passed away, and then my father moved to Muscatine. I think we arrived here about 1935 or 36, and as you know, Walter, I went through high school, and my father lived here all of his life.
Yeah, I know your late father real well, and an awful nice fellow, and I know he was very proud of you in your job and that. Like I say, I was born in 1907, and we farmed. We lived on the farm around West Liberty until about 1923 when we came to Muscatine. And so I spent a good deal of my childhood around West Liberty. I attended country school. I started in country schools, and I also attended the city schools in West Liberty up until my sophomore year. And I have a lot of experiences that I'm reminded of ever so often. And I often thought perhaps maybe I'd like to go back to retire, but I never did. I've still stayed here. And I can recall my father and my grandfather and them speaking or telling about Jesse James and his gang and different ones like that. That a lot of the things that they'd done were very close to around this area up in Minnesota and different parts of Iowa, and they seemed like the bad guys to them, but apparently some people didn't think so. Now, I was fortunate. I think it was in the 50s. I got to go down in Missouri and see where Jesse James lived. The old house is still there, but of course they got a new house alongside of it, and kind of a thrill for me to think to see something like that. But I also heard my folks talk about Buffalo Bill, who, you know, was born up here northwest of Davenport, and he was my hero, and especially about the Pony Express and how they fought the Indians and different things like that. And I had the privilege when I was a young child, or about 6, 7 years old, to see Buffalo Bill and also the Wild West show, and that is still vivid in my mind, and it's one of the great thrills that I had at that time. And you heard things about those different things. Of course, they didn't have radios, about not much, maybe the crystal sets, but there was no television or anything like that, and sometimes it was days before you ever heard the report of what was going on. And it's so much different than it is today. Now, when I got a little older and was able to, well, my dad would take me to town, and like on Saturdays, and he'd give me 10 or 15 cents to go to the show. And of course, most of them were Western in those days, and such ones as Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and Tom Mix and those there. And
That's a little before my time, Walter.
yes, but you know, Harlan, really living on a farm that way, I had my pony and that, I more or less had in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a cowboy, but it never materialized. But it was quite a thrill for me to see those different ones. Now, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, my wife and I, had the privilege of seeing one of their shows here a few years back. We got to talk to them personally in that there, and that was very interesting. We had their autographs. And today now, you can still see some of those old-time movies yet on, if you have cable vision or something like that. And they're still interesting to me. And I know in those days it was a thrill for the kids to see that.
I bet.
And of course, in each show that you've seen, there was always the good guys and always the bad guys. And I think that is carried on up all through the history of the world, you know what I mean, it's that way. Now, usually in those shows, there was a sheriff, of course, and of course a lot of times the people took care of their own jurisdiction, you might say, and would hang someone for doing a crime or something like that before they even had got a good trial or that. But there usually was always a U.S. Marshal. Now, was that more or less the beginning of the FBI, or is that in that category?
I think the U.S. Marshal was the initial federal law enforcement presence. And back in the early days, when there was few federal investigative agencies, the Marshal was pretty much the sole federal investigative agency. They looked for fugitives, they caught them, and they essentially were what you thought of as the Federal Investigative Service. Since that time, there have been a number of agencies developed, including the FBI, which, of course, has become probably the premier federal investigative agency. And the Bureau was started in 1908 and was known as the Bureau of Investigation. But then in the 1920s, when J. Edgar Hoover took over, it got its present name, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Early on, and then the Bureau the FBI, we call it the Bureau, got into looking for federal fugitives. They kind of took over what the Marshal Service had done previously. And until today, the Bureau's jurisdiction has grown to something like 200 specific violations.
I see.
And the Bureau does, its jurisdiction is pretty carefully defined. It's defined by statute. And so they have the fugitive program, they have security responsibilities, they have interstate crimes, organized crime, white-collar crime. And of course this is developed through the years. But you're right, the U.S. Marshal Service initially was pretty much what you thought of when you thought of the federal police or federal law enforcement, so to speak.
Yeah. Now, like you say, the FBI started in 1924, and I can recall reading about J. Edgar Hoover, and he was more or less a taskmaster, wasn't he? That is, I mean, he really wanted things done the way he wanted them done, as I understand it.
You're right on mark on that, Walter. There's no doubt as to who was boss and who was running the organization. But and I would say, and when he took over in 1924, the Bureau had been a kind of an agency where they just, well, it was political appointments. If you knew someone, you got appointed.
Yeah.
And when Hoover took over, he said, I'll take the condition. He said, I'll take the head of the FBI on one condition, and that is that I can hire and fire based on merit. And the Attorney General said, I wouldn't have it any other way. So he started ousting all of these people that were incompetent and corrupt from the organization, and he started hiring basically only attorneys and accountants and people that were competent, people of integrity. And as you know, Walter, for 48 years he remained as director of the FBI, and he built it into what I would like to think is probably the finest investigative agency in the world. But he did, come back to your question, he insisted on absolute loyalty. He insisted on a good day's work for a day's pay. He insisted on high caliber people, and he wanted perfection. He demanded perfection, and I think that's probably why, and I think, you know, the Bureau had a number of successes under J. Edgar Hoover in many fields, and I think that's why the Bureau has always had far more applicants for the special agent position than they can fill. But he was a taskmaster, and I talked to him on several occasions, and you didn't have to worry about who was going to carry the conversation. But he did it. You better be prepared to take notes and make a record of what he was saying.
Well, now, as I understand it, like around 1930, 1940, there was added jurisdictions to the FBI. Now, what did some of those things cover? That is, would they give you a little more leeway or something?
Well, the Congress passed the Fugitive Felon Act, which essentially enabled the, if you remember back, John Dillinger and Ma Barker and Babyface Nelson and the famous fugitives of the 30s. I'm sure you remember those names
very
well. Well, particularly Dillinger would rob a bank in one state and flee to another state, and the local authorities didn't have any jurisdiction in the other state. So Congress passed what they called the Fugitive Felon Act, which gave the FBI authority to, well, essentially on a nationwide basis. In other words, state line didn't mean anything. We could investigate in one state and arrest in another state, and this came into play in the 30s. This was probably one of the biggest things where the FBI started looking for badly wanted state fugitives. Now, another thing that came in, you probably remember the Lindbergh kidnapping in 1934.
Yes.
This was another case where the Lindbergh baby was abducted and killed shortly thereafter. But they passed the federal kidnapping law, where it permitted the FBI to come into the case if there was some indication of an abduction, and there was the child was gone 24 hours and a ransom demand was received that gave the FBI jurisdiction. So these were a couple, and then the federal bank robbery statute was passed because of the numerous banks being robbed. So that we kind of refer to the 30s as the gangster era, and a lot of these more colorful individuals was associated with the FBI, and I think the FBI had some pretty good success in apprehending and seeing these people prosecuted.
Yeah. Well, I know I personally remember them, and in '32 when the World's Fair was on, I went to Chicago to a church convention, and then of course we attended the World's Fair, and when you got in Chicago, you felt that was an altogether different world than what you were living out here in the country, or out in the rural area. And although I never seen any gangster or anything like that, I wasn't looking for them either. But you're speaking of these different ones, like well, even Bonnie and Clyde. I can recall when this couple, they were looking for them, and around Muscatine here, I can recall that they had roadblocks here because I think it was down in Missouri that they finally got them, if I remember right, and they just riddled their car with bullets and stuff. I mean, finally they got them, and those things come back to me now, and of course there's nothing that we could do about it. It is the citizens, but nevertheless, we always had that fear. We didn't know maybe some they may hit us somewhat personally ourselves. But then now, of course, I can recall going to the post office, and on the wall there would be a frame with the 10 most wanted men, and they would have letters across there. And I often wondered myself, you would take a read who they are. Of course, you didn't know them, but it reminds me of a little story in regards to the father and the son, or he took his son, about 5, 6 years old, to the post office with him one day, and while the father was mailing a letter and probably buying stamps and that, the little boy looked around at the murals and different things, and he finally spotted one of these posters with the 10 most wanted men on. And so when his father got through, he says, "Dad," he says, "what's that picture of those 10 men up there?" And the father said, "Well, son," he says, "those are bad men." He says, they've committed crimes, and they're being they're being wanted, and he said they have done these crimes, and the FBI was looking for them, and they wanted to arrest them. The little kid looked for a little and thought, and he says, "Well, Dad, why didn't they arrest them when they were taking their pictures?" So,
good point.
yes. So sometimes these little kids that come up with some very good things.
Well, Walter, that 10 Most Wanted program was initiated back in early 1950s in connection with United Press International, and it's proved to be a very successful thing in locating and apprehending some badly wanted fugitives. And the criteria for it is the person has to have normally been involved in some real bad, heinous crime, and it has to be a situation where they feel that if substantial publicity would help generate and help apprehend the person. And over the years, since the early 50s, as I say, any number of citizens, like you say, have observed pictures in the post office walls or in the newspaper, and they've called in and furnished information, and on any number of occasions, the citizen cooperation has assisted in giving a lead to bring about the apprehension of a 10 most wanted person. And it goes to show the importance of citizen participation in federal or local law enforcement.
Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah, I've noticed them, and like I say, I was in the post office here a while back, and I didn't see that particular poster, but there is a poster, maybe of 2 or 3 people out there, and I didn't pay attention to what they were looking at. But That is quite interesting.
It's generated a lot of interest and a lot of publicity, and I think it's well known. The Bureau's 10 Most Wanted Fugitive program has been well publicized.
Yeah. And now, in regards to a local crime, we'll say, for instance, that you were at a certain locality and you've seen a personal crime being committed. As an FBI agent, were you able to go in and arrest that person? They're saying there's no other authorities around.
Well, as I say, the Bureau's jurisdiction is quite specific to particular crimes. If it was a bank robbery and I observed it, I could under under federal crime. But as you know, most crimes are local in nature, a local robbery or a burglary or a murder. As an FBI agent, I would really have no official jurisdiction, no official authority, but if, as any other citizen, I observe a crime, a felony being committed in my presence, and I have adequate reason to believe that person A committed that crime, I could make an arrest as a citizen's arrest. But really, as having authority as an FBI agent, no. But I think people tend to think that the FBI has ultimate authority to do anything. Well, and it's not true.
Yeah, well, I more or less was under that impression years ago, but as you state now, you got to have a specific reason to arrest them. That is, I mean, as an FBI agent.
It can be very helpful sometimes because if a person, talking about bad guys, if the bad guy is uncertain as to exactly how much authority you have, then that's an advantage for you.
Oh, yes.
And so you can use that to your advantage.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to get a little bit about the common crimes, since this is a seasoned citizen program, and we direct most of our programs toward the older citizens. There's a lot of crimes and that against the older citizen today now are being perpetuated, and could you enlighten us a little something on that?
Yeah, there's several, Walter, that I think are most common. One is that comes to mind is what they call the bank examiner scheme. And in this situation, an individual will normally come to an older person's home and represent himself to be with local law enforcement or federal law enforcement and say, we're investigating what we think is a dishonest person at the bank, and would you cooperate with us and go down and draw out $5,000 or $10,000 from your savings account? Well, of course, sometimes the person will do this. They come back and the individual says, well, I'll need to hold on to this now as evidence and I'll get it back to you. Well, of course, you know the person never sees the money again. But the point there is legitimate law enforcement will never ask a citizen to draw money out of their bank. They just never do it. And a person should not, they ought to call the head of the agency or the head of the bank if they have any questions. The second thing I think of is what they call the pigeon drop swindle. And in this scenario, normally an elderly citizen will be coming down the street and the criminal will pretend that he's found a large bundle of cash in the street, $5,000, $10,000. And so he strikes up a conversation with the elder citizen and said, what should we do with this? What are we going to do? So they talk a while, and the criminal says, well, I'll consult with my friend. Well, he consults somebody, and he said, well, look, we can split this, but you need, for good faith, you need to put up an equal amount of money.
Oh, yes.
So sometimes the innocent elderly person draws out an equal amount, and they put it together, and there again, of course, there's a sleight of hand, or he excuses himself and disappears with the money. So I guess the old adage is, if anything seems too good to be true, it probably is. It's better for a person to check out the situation and make sure that it's legitimate before they draw money out of the bank. But these are two of the common schemes that are perpetrated on older people.
Yeah.
Another thing is I might say, Walter, it wouldn't fit into a federal crime, but I've seen a number of homes burglarized or robbed while a person is attending a funeral or a wedding or something that's well publicized in the paper. Burglars tend to watch those events, and they know the entire family is going to be attending a funeral or a wedding, and they feel that's an opportune time for them to strike the home. So I guess the moral there is, if your family does have a funeral or some event they're attending, might be a good idea to have a house sitter to stay home to make sure that someone doesn't break in and steal.
Well, you know, I can recall when I was a kid, we never had to lock a house or anything like that, and now it seems like if you don't lock your house or something, well, even if you do lock it, they can get in too sometimes. Sure. Now, in the FBI change in 1930, I think you mentioned that made a lot of difference in the things that you could do and that you could not do in regards to organized crime and illegal drugs and such things. Are they working on that pretty strong now?
They are now, Walter. I guess I've seen in the 30s it was the interstate crime, federal fugitives, kidnapping, bank robberies that were main thing. We got into the 40s and we got into the war, and we had more responsibilities in the security area, looking at individuals that might have been engaged in espionage or sabotage, security checks on individuals engaged in the war effort. Then we got into the 50s and the 60s. The Bureau got more involved in organized crime activities, and to some extent, well, into the investigation of the Mafia, La Cosa Nostra. And then in the 70s, more into the investigation of illegal drugs, the money dealers dealing in drugs, and also into white-collar crime. With the advent of computers, you know, individuals could steal millions or thousands or millions of dollars by utilizing a computer or engaging in some type of swindle in the white-collar area. So these are kind of the ways that the trend that I've seen during the years. They've never really taken away a lot of jurisdiction. They've always added more to the Bureau, so we've needed more FBI agents. But that's kind of the trend that I've seen through the years.
About how many agents would you say now that they would be like in the United States?
Presently, when I left in '81, there was like 9,000 FBI agents all through the United States. I think when I came into the FBI in 1955, there was something like about 5,000 agents, so it doubled in about those 27 years. But, you know, even you think 10,000 across the United States is really not a large number of federal personnel.
Yeah. Well, Harlan, I think we could sit here for quite a while longer and talk about different things like that, but it's getting close to our closing time, and I certainly want to thank you for enlightening us on many of these matters. And you know, I'd rather be sitting here talking to you, and instead of having you come up behind me and put your hand on my shoulder and say, "You're under arrest. This is the FBI." So,
sure, you don't have to worry, Walter.
Yeah. But it's been very enjoyable to talk with you, and we want to thank our viewers, and we want to welcome their contents. I want to thank the crew and the Heritage Cablevision, and I'd like to close with this thought. Take time each day to do a good deed for someone, and do it with a smile. Thank you.